EA, Electronic Arts, has denied that they are working on a Dead Space 2 remake. The reason for this is because the first game, which came out last year in January, didn't sell that great. And right now, the developers of that game, EA Motive, who's worked on games like Star Wars Battlefront 2 and the Dead Space remake and Star Wars Squadrons, they're working on an Iron Man game right now, a single-player Iron Man game that I believe is likely going to be an open-world experience. And they've also been pulled to help collaborate on the next entry in the Battlefield franchise, which I understand that considering their experience with the franchise, but considering that the last Battlefield game basically flopped with Battlefield 2042, it's surprising to me that EA is even bothering at this point to make another Battlefield game. But that's not what I'm focusing this video on. This news may have surprised quite a few people. It certainly surprised me to a degree, but it's not out of the realm of common sense as to why the Dead Space remake didn't sell that great. I think there's two primary reasons why that game underperformed, and I'm going to explain why. But before I get to that, Jeff Grubb, whom I'm not sure who he's employed under, this is about, I think, the second or the third time that this guy has made some ridiculous claim and didn't have any facts to back up what he was saying. And I made the mistake of making a video reporting on information that came from Jeff Grubb, which was about the Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic remake apparently being canceled, although there was a huge media circus with that particular topic. Now the guy is saying that games that aren't in development are in development, and EA had to come out and say that no, this guy is full of shit, he doesn't know what he's talking about. There is no Dead Space remake that's in development right now. And a company like EA, they don't normally comment on rumors. So for them to go and tell IGN, of all publications, that there is no validity to this story, I mean, that speaks wonders. So we know for a fact, because EA has told IGN, point blank, there is no Dead Space remake that's in development right now. Once again, it's because the first game underperformed in sales. Now, I bought and played the Dead Space remake when it came out last year. I thought it was a very well done, faithful remake to one of the greatest horror games, one of the greatest survival horror games ever made. And it was one of the best games that came out last year, and there were a lot of great games that came out last year. 2023 was a great year for video games, and that's an understatement. It really was an outstanding year for the industry. But why? So the question is, despite the game being as good as it is, and as it was when it came out, why did it underperform? I think there are two basic, simple explanations. Number one, Dead Space as a franchise had been basically shelved for a number of years since 2013. Last year was actually the first Dead Space game released, the first major Dead Space game released since 2013's Dead Space 3. The series had been put on the shelf for basically a decade, which means in all of that time, the series has clearly lost its relevancy. And another smaller point is that, the game was a remake. A number of people that I saw posting online, they wanted a Dead Space 4. They wanted a continuation rather than a remake. Now, it makes sense why EA didn't go forward with a Dead Space 4. They wanted to test the popularity of the franchise with a remake, given that, the series, as I just said, had been on the shelf for so long. They wanted to see exactly how many units the series was capable of moving. A remake to the first game just seemed like the common sense way to go. I would agree that was the right move. Unfortunately, it proved to EA that working on any new games in the Dead Space IP probably isn't what's best for business. After you put a franchise on the shelf for that long, for that length of time, people tend to forget about it, and people tend to, move on to other things. And I think the Dead Space remake suffered from that. But an even greater point, and I think this is probably the biggest reason why the game didn't sell that well. The Dead Space remake came out in a year that was stacked. And I mean really stacked. And not just in general across all major genres, but specifically for the survival horror genre. And it wasn't even the only major remake that came out that year. 2 months after Dead Space came out, we got the remake to Resident Evil 4, which is clearly the larger game. And Resident Evil 4 originally was the game that inspired Dead Space in the first place. More people were excited for a Resident Evil 4 remake over a Dead Space remake. And when you factor all the games that came out last year, more people were going to wait and spend their money on games such as the Resident Evil 4 remake, other games that, were going to come later in the year with Alan Wake 2 or Diablo 4 or Armored Core 6. More people were excited for other games that, were scheduled for release last year than Dead Space. Dead Space was, if it was on your list at all, it was basically at the bottom of your list in comparison to everything else. Unless you're someone like me who really enjoys survival horror games, and a Dead Space remake would be higher up on your list in comparison to other games, but I recognize that I'm in the minority on that front. It's unfortunate. I personally would have liked to see a remake to Dead Space 2. It's disappointing that it's likely we'll never get it, although EA didn't flat out say that it's never going to happen. They just said that it's not being worked on right now, but because the first game didn't meet their sales expectations, it's unlikely that we're ever going to see a remake to Dead Space 2, and it's certainly a game that deserves a remake, I think. But unfortunately, it's probably not meant to be. And while it's disappointing news, I'm certainly not upset over it. I think we were lucky enough to get a remake to the first game. The fact that there's a remake to the first Dead Space, and it's something that's authentic, that exists, and it came out and it was good, so good in fact that it actually rivals the quality of the original game by a substantial margin. I mean, it's a miracle that game turned out to be any good. I could say the same for the Resident Evil 4 remake. So if they never get to a remake to Dead Space 2, I'm content with the fact that, we got a remake to the first game, if it doesn't go any further than that. Not to mention, I'm kind of at a point where I'm getting sick and tired of the whole remake trend. I think after the remakes for Metal Gear Solid Snake Eater and Silent Hill 2, there's not too many games that I'd be interested in supporting a remake for. And there's a number of remakes that are still in development now. There's a remake to The Witcher 1 that's in development. There's a remake to The Prince of Persia Sands of Time from Ubisoft, as well as a first Splinter Cell, both of which are still in development. There was a rumored remake some time ago for Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. It wasn't and still hasn't been officially confirmed, but that was rumored to be in development. And while some of those sound interesting, they don't carry the same weight as, something like Dead Space or Resident Evil or anything of that nature. I want to see new games, new IP, even if it's a licensed game, like all these superhero games that are in development right now, or the Star Wars game that's coming out later this year. Because the one thing that's lacking with the 9th generation of gaming is new IP. New games. IGN even did a poll on this recently on their website. So the question was, what did you expect from this console generation that the Series X and the PS5 didn't deliver on. And by far the winner of this poll, based on 47,000 voters, is true current gen games. In other words, new IP. We've had very, very few actual new, current gen games, and even less new IP this entire generation. I can't really think of one major new IP that's not just a ripoff or a clone of something else that's been released this generation. Some of these newer IPs, such as Stellar Blade, that's coming out this month. That is just a Sekiro clone that's also ripping off Nier Automata. The Lies of P game that came out last year, that was basically just a clone of Bloodborne. It's like, I already have Bloodborne. I've already played Bloodborne. Why do I need to play this game? We have too many sequels that, have come out. Not enough new IP. Diablo 4, Armored Core 6, Marvel Spider-Man 2, God of War Ragnarok, Horizon Forbidden West, Resident Evil Village, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. All of these games are sequels. They're continuations of long-established franchises. And there's more sequels to come. The next one is Hellblade 2. That's coming out next month. We've had 2 more earlier this year, Helldivers 2 and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Both of them sequels. So it doesn't bother me that a remake to an older game, as good as Dead Space 2 is not being worked on right now. I want to see what EA Motive does with their Iron Man game. I want to see how this game turns out, and what they're going to do with this, rather than have them make a Dead Space 2 remake. I already have Dead Space 2. I've played it multiple times on 3 different platforms. So, yes, it's disappointing, but I'm not upset about it. We need new games. We need new IP. More new IP. We need less sequels. We need more innovation. A Dead Space 2 remake definitely would not have delivered in the innovation department.